The sun was beginning to set over Ocean View Resort, casting long shadows across the main swimming pool. Marco Delgado, a 24-year-old pool attendant with dark hair and kind eyes, was finishing his evening duties. He had worked at the luxury hotel for almost 3 years now, and the routine was familiar: collect towels, check water levels, and make sure all pool toys were stored properly before heading home. Most guests had already left for dinner, leaving the pool area quiet and peaceful. Marco hummed softly to himself as he moved around the edge of the pool with his cleaning cart. It had been a busy day with the hotel at full capacity due to a wedding party and several business conferences happening simultaneously. As Marco bent down to pick up an abandoned magazine, something caught his eye: a strange shape beneath the water's surface near the deep end. At first, he thought it might be a towel or pool toy, but his instincts told him something wasn't right. The shape was too small, too still. "Hello?" Marco called out, scanning the area for any guests. No one answered. The shape moved slightly with the gentle ripple of the water. Marco squinted, trying to make out what it was. His heart suddenly froze in his chest. It looked like a small arm. Without a second thought, Marco dropped the magazine and raced to the edge of the pool. He kicked off his shoes and dove in, fully clothed in his hotel uniform. The cold water shocked his system, but he swam with powerful strokes toward the small figure. As he got closer, his worst fears were confirmed. A small child, probably no more than a year and a half old, was floating face down in the water, completely motionless. Marco reached the baby in seconds, gently turning the tiny body over. The child's eyes were closed, lips already showing a hint of blue. "Help!" Marco shouted as he cradled the baby and swam to the edge of the pool. "Somebody help!" An elderly couple walking past the pool area heard his cries and rushed over. The woman gasped in horror while her husband immediately pulled out his phone to call for help. Marco lifted the baby onto the pool deck and climbed out, water streaming from his soaked uniform. The child wasn't breathing. Marco had taken the mandatory CPR course the hotel required for all pool staff, but he had never needed to use it until now. "Call 911. He instructed the couple as he positioned the baby on his back and checked for breathing again. Nothing. With trembling but determined hands, Marco began chest compressions, carefully pressing down on the tiny chest with 2 fingers, then giving gentle rescue breaths. He counted aloud, trying to keep his panic under control. "Come on, little one," he whispered between breaths. "Please." Seconds felt like hours as Marco continued CPR. The elderly man was speaking urgently into his phone, while his wife had run to the hotel lobby for more help. In the distance, Marco could hear shouts and running footsteps. After what seemed like forever, it was actually only 30 seconds, the baby suddenly jerked and coughed. Water dribbled from the small mouth, followed by a weak cry that quickly grew stronger. Marco nearly collapsed with relief. "That's it. Good job, little buddy," he said, gently turning the child to his side as the baby continued to cough and cry. Hotel security arrived moments later, followed by frantic parents who had been dining at the hotel restaurant. Believing their child was with a teenage cousin, the mother's screams turned to sobs of relief when she saw her baby crying and moving. As paramedics rushed in with a stretcher, Marco stepped back, suddenly aware of his soaking wet uniform and the crowd gathering around. The baby's father gripped Marco's shoulder, tears streaming down his face. "You saved him," the man said simply. "You saved our son." Marco nodded, unable to speak as the adrenaline began to wear off. He had no idea that this moment of heroism would soon turn his life upside down. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their sirens cutting through the evening quiet at Ocean View Resort. They quickly took over care of the small child, placing an oxygen mask over his tiny face while checking his vital signs. Marco stood nearby, dripping wet in his soaked uniform, his body beginning to shake as the adrenaline wore off. "You did good work here," said one of the paramedics, a woman with kind eyes and efficient hands. "Another minute underwater, and we might be telling a different story." The baby's parents couldn't tear themselves away from their child. The mother, a woman in her early 30s with tear-stained cheeks, kept touching her baby's face and hands as if to make sure he was really there. The father, still in shock, alternated between watching the paramedics work and glancing at Marco with overwhelming gratitude. "I don't understand how this happened," the mother said, her voice breaking. We left him with my nephew for just 20 minutes while we had dinner. A teenage boy, no older than 15, stood a few feet away, his face pale and eyes red from crying. "I'm so sorry, Aunt Lisa," he said. He was right next to me, and then I looked at my phone for just a second. Hotel guests had gathered around the scene, many still in their dinner clothes, whispering and pointing. Some were filming with their phones, which made Marco uncomfortable. He wasn't looking for attention or praise, he had simply done what anyone would do. Jessica Chen, the hotel manager on duty, pushed through the crowd. She was a tall woman with a perpetually serious expression, and she did not look happy. "What happened here?" she demanded, looking from the paramedics to Marco. Before Marco could answer, the baby's father stepped forward. "Your employee saved my son's life," he said firmly. If he hadn't spotted him in the pool and acted so quickly, he couldn't finish the sentence. Jessica's expression softened slightly, but her eyes remained concerned as she surveyed the scene. The gathering crowd, the paramedics, the soaking wet employee. "The pool was supposed to be closed," she said quietly to Marco. "Where was Darren?" "He's the lifeguard on evening duty. His shift ended at 6, Marco explained. "I was just cleaning up when I saw something in the water." One of the hotel security guards, an older man named Paul who had always been friendly to Marco, stepped closer. "The cameras caught everything," he said in a low voice. Kid went straight to the pool edge while the teenager was looking at his phone. Slipped in without a splash. Marco here didn't hesitate, just jumped right in. The paramedics finished their assessment and prepared to transport the baby to the hospital for observation. The child was now fully conscious, crying loudly, a good sign according to the medical team. "We need a name for our report," said the female paramedic, looking at Marco. "Marco Delgado," he replied. The baby's father stepped forward and clasped Marco's hand between both of his own. "Marco Delgado," he repeated, as if committing the name to memory. "I'm David Wells, and this is my wife Lisa. Our son is Noah. I don't know how we can ever thank you enough." Lisa Wells, still holding her son's hand as the paramedics prepared to lift the stretcher, looked at Marco with tears in her eyes. "You're our guardian angel," she whispered. Marco felt his face grow warm with embarrassment. "I just did my job," he said simply. As the paramedics began to move Noah toward the ambulance, David handed Marco a business card. "This isn't over," he said firmly. "We'll be in touch." Jessica Chen cleared her throat. "Marco, once things settle down here, I'll need you to fill out an incident report." Her tone was professional but with an edge that made Marco uneasy. "Mr. Winters will want to review everything in the morning." Marco nodded, a small knot forming in his stomach at the mention of Frank Winters, the operations manager known for his strict adherence to hotel policies. He watched as the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle pulled away, sirens once again breaking the night's silence. He had no way of knowing that his simple act of heroism had set in motion a chain of events that would turn his life upside down. The morning after the rescue, Marco arrived at work with dark circles under his eyes. He had barely slept, his mind replaying the rescue over and over. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the small, lifeless body in the water. Then he would remember the sound of Noah's first cry after the CPR, and a wave of relief would wash over him again. Marco changed into his fresh uniform in the staff locker room. Several coworkers were already there, and the room fell silent when he entered. Then, suddenly, everyone was talking at once. "Dude, you're all over the internet," said Miguel, another pool attendant, showing Marco his phone. Sure enough, a hotel guest had uploaded a video of the rescue aftermath, and it had thousands of views already. "The way you jumped in without even thinking. That was amazing," said Sarah from housekeeping. Marco shook his head modestly. "Anyone would have done the same." "Not everyone," replied Miguel. "Not everyone would notice, and not everyone knows CPR. You saved that kid's life." The door to the locker room swung open, and Victoria Wells, the assistant manager, stood in the doorway. She was a thin woman in her 40s with perfectly styled blonde hair and a permanent frown line between her eyebrows. "Marco," she said coldly, "Mr. Winters wants to see you in his office. Now." The locker room fell silent again as Marco followed Victoria down the hallway. He had expected to be called in. There would be paperwork to fill out, procedures to follow. What he didn't expect was the tension radiating from Victoria as they walked. The family called this morning, she said without looking at him. The baby is doing fine. They're keeping him another day for observation, but the doctors expect a full recovery. That's great news, Marco said, relieved. Victoria stopped suddenly and turned to face him. This isn't great news for the hotel, Marco. Do you understand what kind of liability issues this creates for us? A child nearly drowned in our pool. The parents could sue us for millions. Marco stared at her in disbelief. But the child is okay. No thanks to our safety protocols, Victoria snapped. The pool was supposed to be closed. You were supposed to be cleaning, not playing lifeguard. Before Marco could respond, they reached Frank Winter's office. Victoria knocked sharply and opened the door without waiting for a response. Frank Winters sat behind a large desk, his gray hair neatly combed, his expression unreadable. He was known throughout the hotel for his strict management style and focus on the bottom line. "Sit down, Marco," he said, gesturing to a chair. Victoria took a seat in the corner, her tablet ready to take notes. "I've reviewed the preliminary incident report," Winters began, tapping a folder on his desk, "and I have some concerns." Marco sat up straighter. "The baby is going to be fine, sir. The parents called this morning." "I'm aware of the child's condition," Winters interrupted. "What concerns me is your breach of protocol." Marco's confusion must have shown on his face, because Winters continued with a hint of impatience. "The pool closes at 7 p.m. Your job was to clean the area and secure it, not to interact with guests or provide emergency services. But, sir, there was a child drowning. A situation that should have been handled by our designated lifeguard or emergency response team," Winters cut in. The lifeguard had already left for the day, Marco explained, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. "Then security should have been called immediately," Winters countered. "By diving in yourself, you put both the child and the hotel at risk. What if you had made the situation worse? What if you had injured the child during your attempted rescue?" Marco couldn't believe what he was hearing. "But I didn't make it worse. I saved him." Victoria spoke up from the corner. "We've already had calls from 3 different lawyers this morning, Marco. The family may be grateful now, but when they start thinking about the fact that their child nearly drowned at our hotel, that gratitude might turn into a lawsuit." A knock at the door interrupted the conversation. Paul, the security guard from the previous night, poked his head in. "Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Winters, but the Wells family is on the phone again. They're insisting on speaking with Marco personally." Winters frowned. "Tell them Marco is in a meeting and will return their call later." As Paul closed the door, Winters turned back to Marco with a stern expression. "For now, you're on administrative leave with pay while we investigate this incident further. Turn in your badge to Victoria before you leave today." Marco felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. He had saved a child's life, and now he was being punished for it. As he stood to leave, he couldn't help but wonder if there was more to this story than he understood. Marco spent the next day in his small apartment, pacing back and forth across the worn carpet. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from coworkers asking what was happening, but he didn't know what to tell them. Administrative leave felt like punishment for doing the right thing. At noon, his phone rang with an unknown number. Marco hesitated before answering. "Hello? Is this Marco Delgado?" asked a woman's voice. "Yes, speaking." "This is Lisa Wells, Noah's mother. We've been trying to reach you." Her voice was warm and emotional. "We wanted to thank you again. The doctors say if you hadn't acted so quickly." Her voice broke. "Well, we wouldn't be taking our son home today." Marco sat down on his couch, relief washing over him. "I'm so glad he's okay, Mrs. Wells. Please call me Lisa. My husband and I want to meet with you, to thank you properly. Could we take you to dinner tonight?" Marco hesitated. Would meeting the family make his situation at work worse? "I'd like that," he said finally. "But I should tell you that the hotel has put me on administrative leave because of what happened." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Administrative leave? For saving our son?" "They said I broke protocol by jumping in instead of calling security." "That's ridiculous." Lisa's voice rose in anger. "If you had waited for security, Noah would be." She couldn't finish the sentence. "They arranged to meet at a restaurant near the hospital at 7 that evening." Marco hung up feeling slightly better. At least the Wells family understood what he had done and why. At 6:30, Marco's phone rang again. This time it was Victoria Wells from the hotel. "Marco, Mr. Winters needs to see you tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. sharp. Don't be late." Her tone gave nothing away, but Marco felt a knot forming in his stomach. Is this about the investigation? "Just be there at 9. Victoria replied curtly before hanging up. The dinner with the Wells family was both heartwarming and awkward. David and Lisa couldn't stop thanking Marco, while little Noah, completely recovered, played happily with his food in a high chair. They shared pictures of Noah in the hospital, now smiling and active as if nothing had happened. "The doctors said there should be no lasting effects," David explained. "Because of how quickly you performed CPR, he didn't suffer any oxygen deprivation." When Marco mentioned his meeting with Mr. Winters the next day, David's expression darkened. "I don't understand why they're treating you this way," he said. "We've called the hotel multiple times to commend you, not complain. We'd have no intention of suing anyone." "Mr. Winters seems to think I should have followed different procedures," Marco explained. Lisa shook her head in disbelief. "What procedure is better than saving a drowning child?" The next morning, Marco arrived at the hotel at 8:45 a.m. He noticed several of his coworkers watching him with concerned expressions as he made his way to Winter's office. Some gave him thumbs-up signs or whispered words of encouragement. Winters was already at his desk when Marco entered, along with Victoria, and now a third person, James Reed from Human Resources. Marco's heart sank. The presence of HR could only mean one thing. "Sit down, Marco," Winters said, not looking up from the papers in front of him. Marco sat, his mouth suddenly dry. Winters finally looked up, his face expressionless. "We've completed our investigation of the incident on Tuesday evening. After reviewing witness statements, security footage, and our safety protocols, we've come to a decision." He slid a document across the desk toward Marco. "Your actions demonstrated a blatant disregard for hotel procedures and put both yourself and our guests at risk. Your employment with Ocean View Resort is being terminated, effective immediately." Marco stared at the termination paper in shock. "You're firing me for saving a child's life?" James from HR cleared his throat. "The official reason is violation of safety protocols and unauthorized engagement with guests in an emergency situation." "This is wrong," Marco said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You know this is wrong." Winter's expression hardened. "What I know is that you created a liability issue for this hotel. Turn in your access card and uniform before you leave today." As Marco stood to leave, stunned and angry, Victoria couldn't meet his eyes. Only James from HR spoke again. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "not everyone agrees with this decision." Marco walked out of the office with his head held high, but his heart was heavy. How could doing the right thing cost him his job? Marco walked slowly through the employee corridor, the termination paper clutched tightly in his hand. The document felt heavy, as if made of stone rather than paper. Coworkers stopped to stare as he passed, word having spread quickly through the hotel staff grapevine. "Is it true?" whispered Sarah from housekeeping, catching up to him. "They actually fired you." Marco nodded, unable to find words. The unfairness of it all had created a knot in his throat. "That's insane," Sarah continued, keeping pace with him. "Everyone's talking about it. Paul from security is furious. He said the footage clearly shows you saved that baby's life." They reached the staff locker room, which fell silent as Marco entered. He moved to his locker and began emptying it mechanically, a spare uniform, his swimming certification cards, a few personal items. The other employees watched in uncomfortable silence, nobody knowing quite what to say. Miguel finally approached and put a hand on Marco's shoulder. "This isn't right, man. We should all protest or something." Marco shook his head. "Don't risk your jobs. I'll be okay." But would he? The reality of his situation was starting to sink in. At 24, with no college degree, good jobs were hard to find. He had rent due in 2 weeks and barely $600 in savings. His mother depended on him to help with her medical bills. The weight of these worries pressed down on him as he cleared out his locker. As Marco was turning in his uniform, Paul from security appeared at the door, his face red with anger. "This is a disgrace," Paul said loudly. "I watched that footage a dozen times." "You did everything right, kid. Everything." Winters has gone too far this time. Victoria Wells appeared behind Paul, her face tight with tension. That's enough, Paul. This is a personnel matter that doesn't concern you. Paul turned to her, not backing down. It concerns all of us when doing the right thing gets punished. What message does this send to the rest of us? Marco appreciated the support, but he didn't want others to suffer because of him. It's okay, Paul. I appreciate you standing up for me. Victoria cleared her throat awkwardly. Marco, I need your keycard and ID badge before you leave. Marco handed them over without a word. Victoria seemed like she wanted to say something more, but instead turned and walked quickly away. As Marco gathered his few possessions into a small box, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from David Wells. Just heard what happened. This is unacceptable. Call us immediately. Outside in the employee parking lot, Marco placed the box in the trunk of his old Honda. The sun was shining, tourists were arriving with smiling faces, and everything seemed so normal, except his life had just been turned upside down. He sat in his car for a moment, trying to process everything. Through the windshield, he could see the main pool area where just 3 days ago he had pulled little Noah from the water. Would he have done anything differently, knowing the outcome? No, he realized. He would make the same choice every time. His phone rang. David Wells again. Marco answered, his voice flat. They really fired you? David asked, skipping any greeting. For saving Noah? Officially for violating protocols, Marco replied. This is outrageous, David said, his voice shaking with anger. Lisa and I won't stand for it. What they've done is not only morally wrong, it's probably illegal. We're meeting with our attorney this afternoon. Marco felt uneasy. I don't want to cause more trouble. You didn't cause this trouble, David interrupted. Frank Winters did, and we're not going to let him get away with it. As Marco drove home, his emotions swung between gratitude for the Wells family's support and anxiety about his future. 3 years of excellent performance reviews, all the extra training he'd done, his perfect attendance record, none of it had mattered in the end. At a red light, he glanced at his phone and saw dozens of notifications. His coworkers had started a group chat called Justice for Marco, and it was filling with messages of support. Despite everything, a small smile crossed his face. He might have lost his job, but he hadn't lost his integrity. And somehow, Marco felt that would matter more in the long run. That evening, Marco sat at his small kitchen table staring at job listings on his laptop. Nothing seemed promising. Most hotel positions required references, and he worried about what Ocean View Resort would say about him. His phone kept buzzing with supportive messages from former coworkers, but their kind words couldn't pay his bills. Marco's phone rang again. This time it was Lisa Wells. Marco, have you seen Facebook yet? She asked without preamble. No, why? David posted about what happened. He included photos of Noah and explained how you saved him, then got fired for it. It's been shared over 5,000 times already. Marco quickly opened Facebook on his laptop. There it was. A heartfelt post from David Wells with photos of a smiling Noah in the hospital, alongside a picture of Marco that must have been taken during their dinner. The caption read, "This man saved our son from drowning at Ocean View Resort. The hotel fired him for it. Share to show Ocean View that heroes deserve better." I don't know what to say, Marco said, scrolling through hundreds of outraged comments. You don't have to say anything, Lisa replied. But local news stations are calling us. They want to interview you. Would that be okay? Marco hesitated. He needed a new job, not publicity. But maybe this was the only way to clear his name. Okay, he agreed finally. By the next morning, the post had been shared over 50,000 times. Marco's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters, radio stations, even a national morning show wanted his story. His former coworkers sent screenshots of chaos at the hotel, angry phone calls flooding the switchboard, negative reviews pouring in online, and even guests checking out early in protest. At noon, Marco sat nervously in the studio of the local news station. The reporter, a kind-faced woman named Diane, adjusted her microphone. So, Marco, tell us what happened in your own words, she prompted as the cameras began rolling. Marco told the story simply, without dramatics. He described seeing something in the water, jumping in, performing CPR, and the joy of hearing Noah cry again. When asked about being fired, he spoke without bitterness. "I just did what I thought was right," he said. "I would make the same choice again." The Wells family appeared next on the broadcast, Noah happily playing with toys in his mother's lap. "Our son would not be alive today without Marco's quick action," David said firmly. "For the hotel to punish him instead of celebrate him shows a disturbing lack of humanity." After the interview aired, the story exploded. National news picked it up. #Justice for Marco began trending on Twitter. Former guests of Ocean View Resort shared stories of Marco's exceptional service and kindness. A woman wrote about how Marco had found her lost wedding ring in the pool. An elderly man described how Marco had helped him safely enter and exit the water when his arthritis was acting up. By evening, Ocean View Resort's social media accounts were overwhelmed with negative comments. Their phone lines were jammed with callers demanding Marco's reinstatement. Tour companies were canceling bookings. The hotel's stock price began to drop as investors worried about the public relations disaster. Miguel called Marco that night. "Dude, it's chaos here. Victoria has been locked in meetings all day. Winters looks like he's about to explode. And guess what? The owner is flying in tomorrow." The owner? Marco had never even seen Emmanuel Cortez, the reclusive billionaire who owned the Ocean View chain. Yeah, apparently he saw the story on CNN and hit the roof. Nobody's seen him here in years. Later that night, Marco received an unexpected email. It was from James Reed in Human Resources. "Marco, I can't say much, but security has been instructed to preserve all video footage from the incident. Mr. Cortez will be reviewing everything personally tomorrow. Stay by your phone." Marco stared at the message, hope and anxiety battling in his chest. What would the footage show? And would it be enough to change his fate? Emmanuel Cortez stepped off his private jet at 8:30 a.m., his face grim with determination. At 62, Cortez had built the Ocean View Resort chain from nothing, expanding from one small hotel to 15 luxury properties across 3 continents. He rarely visited the individual locations anymore, leaving operations to his management teams. But this situation demanded his personal attention. A car whisked him directly to the hotel, where nervous staff watched as the legendary owner strode through the lobby. His presence alone was enough to create a hush wherever he went. Cortez had not visited this location in over 3 years, and now he arrived during its biggest crisis. "Where is the security office?" he asked the wide-eyed front desk manager. Minutes later, Cortez sat in the small, windowless security room, surrounded by monitors. Paul, the security chief, stood nervously beside him. "Show me everything," Cortez commanded. "From the beginning." Paul pulled up the footage from the pool area 4 days earlier. The cameras captured every angle of the near tragedy. The teenage boy distracted by his phone, little Noah wandering away toward the pool, the small splash as he fell in. Then Marco appearing for routine cleaning, noticing something wrong, and diving in without hesitation. The footage clearly showed Marco performing CPR, the paramedics arriving, the parents' tearful gratitude. Cortez watched in silence, his expression unreadable. "Now show me the aftermath," he said when the pool footage ended. Paul hesitated. "Sir, there's something you should know. We have cameras in all the offices for security purposes." He lowered his voice, including Mr. Winters' office. Cortez raised an eyebrow. "Show me." The new footage showed Marco reporting to Winters the morning after the rescue. But there was more footage from earlier that same morning showing Winters in conversation with Victoria Wells. "I don't care if the kid is a hero," Winters was saying, his voice clear through the office microphone. "He's made me look bad for years, always going above and beyond, making the rest of us seem lazy by comparison. The guests love him more than management. This is the perfect opportunity to get rid of him." Victoria looked uncomfortable. "But Frank, he saved a child's life. If we fire him for that." "We're firing him for violating protocol," Winters interrupted. "Make sure HR understands that's the official reason." Cortez's face darkened as he watched. There was more. Winters pressuring the young lifeguard to claim Marco had been told never to enter the pool. Winters deleting emails from the Wells family praising Marco's actions. "That's enough," Cortez said finally, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Call an emergency meeting with all department heads. Now." Within 30 minutes, the hotel's leadership team sat nervously around the conference table. Frank Winters looked particularly uncomfortable, tugging at his collar repeatedly. Cortez remained standing, his presence filling the room. I founded this company 30 years ago with one guiding principle: we treat people right. Guests and employees alike. He paused, looking each person in the eye. What happened here violated everything I believe in. He turned to Winters. You fired an employee for saving a child's life because of personal animosity. You manipulated evidence. You lied. Winters began to stammer a defense, but Cortez cut him off with a raised hand. I've seen the footage, Frank. All of it, including your conversation with Victoria about using this incident to get rid of an employee you personally disliked. The room fell completely silent. Victoria stared at the table, her face pale. Where is this young man now? Cortez asked, turning to HR. James Reed cleared his throat. Marco Delgado is at home, sir. He's been giving interviews to the press about the incident. Good for him, Cortez said. Has anyone actually spoken to the family of the child? They've called multiple times, Victoria admitted quietly. Mr. Winters instructed us not to engage with them. Cortez shook his head in disbelief. He pulled out his phone and made a call, putting it on speaker. Mr. Wells? This is Emmanuel Cortez, owner of Ocean View Resorts. I'd like to personally apologize for what happened to your family and to Marco Delgado. And I'd like to invite both you and Marco to meet with me this afternoon, if possible. As Cortez hung up, he turned back to the management team, his decision made. The truth had been revealed, and now it was time for action. Marco arrived at the Ocean View Resort at exactly 2 p.m., feeling strangely nervous to be returning to his former workplace. Just 5 days had passed since he pulled little Noah from the pool, but it felt like a lifetime ago. He wore his best shirt, a light blue button-down that his mother had insisted he ironed twice. The front desk staff smiled warmly at him as he entered. Several whispered good luck as he passed. Even guests seemed to recognize him, pointing and smiling. His story had clearly spread far and wide. A young woman in a hotel uniform approached. Mr. Delgado? I'm Sophia, Mr. Cortez's assistant. He's waiting for you in the presidential suite. The Wells family is already there. As they rode the elevator to the top floor, Marco tried to calm his racing heart. He had never met the hotel's owner and had no idea what to expect. The doors opened directly into the luxurious presidential suite, where Emmanuel Cortez stood talking with David and Lisa Wells. Noah was playing happily on the carpet with some toy cars. Cortez turned as Marco entered, his stern face breaking into a warm smile. He was shorter than Marco had imagined, with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Marco Delgado, Cortez said, extending his hand. I've been looking forward to meeting you. Marco shook his hand, surprised by the firm, friendly grip. Thank you for inviting me, sir. Noah spotted Marco and toddled over excitedly, arms raised. Up, up, the little boy demanded. Without thinking, Marco scooped him up, and Noah giggled delightedly. He remembers you, Lisa said, smiling through tears. Somehow he knows you're special. Cortez gestured for everyone to sit down. Marco, I've spent the morning reviewing everything that happened here. The security footage, the staff interviews, the social media storm. He shook his head sadly. I want to personally apologize for how you were treated. Thank you, sir, Marco said quietly. I built this company on values, integrity, compassion, excellence. Cortez continued. Frank Winters violated all of them with his actions. That's why, as of this morning, he is no longer employed by Ocean View Resorts. Marco's eyes widened in surprise. Victoria Wells has been demoted pending further review of her role in this situation, Cortez added. And now, to the matter of your future. He slid an envelope across the table to Marco. This contains a formal apology, back pay for the days you missed, and a significant bonus in recognition of your heroism. Marco opened the envelope with trembling fingers. The check inside had more zeros than he had ever seen on a payment to him. But there's more, Cortez said. I'd like to offer you a new position, safety and training coordinator for the entire Ocean View chain. You would develop emergency protocols, conduct training sessions, and ensure that all our properties maintain the highest safety standards. The position comes with a substantial salary increase and would be based right here, with travel to our other locations. Marco could hardly believe what he was hearing. I I don't know what to say. Say yes, David Wells urged, grinning broadly. There's one more thing, Cortez said, his expression becoming more solemn. The Wells family and I have been discussing an appropriate way to honor what happened here. Lisa spoke up, bouncing Noah gently on her knee. We want to create something positive from this experience. Cortez nodded. Together with the Wells family, Ocean View Resorts is establishing the Noah Wells Water Safety Foundation. We'll fund swimming lessons for underprivileged children and water safety training for childcare providers. And we'd like you, Marco, to serve as its first director, alongside your other duties. Tears filled Marco's eyes as the full meaning of these offers sank in. Not only was his job restored, but he was being given an opportunity to make a real difference, to potentially save many more lives. I would be honored, he said simply. 6 months later, Marco stood proudly at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new children's swimming area at Ocean View Resort. The area featured state-of-the-art safety features, multiple lifeguard stations, and a large sign that read Noah's Corner, Safety First. Noah himself, now 2 years old and wearing water wings, giggled as he helped cut the ribbon. His parents stood nearby, alongside Emmanuel Cortez and dozens of hotel staff, many wearing shirts with the foundation's logo. As cameras flashed and applause filled the air, Marco felt a profound sense of gratitude. One quick decision, to dive into that pool, had changed everything. Sometimes, he realized, doing the right thing might seem costly in the moment, but the truth always finds its way to the surface.